My wife cheated on me with my best friend during our vacation. They both received divorce papers at the same time. During my best friend's wedding anniversary party, my best friend's wife and I decided to throw a little celebration of our own. Turns out, this game can be played by two. It all started like one of those classic love stories, the kind you'd expect to see in a movie or read in a paperback novel gathering dust at the back of a bookstore. I met Lisa during our senior year of college, in a cramped coffee shop just off campus. She was sitting by the window, hair falling loosely over her face as she scribbled away in a journal. I'd only gone in for a quick cup of black coffee to push through the last leg of finals week, but somehow I ended up staying there for 2 hours, just watching her and pretending not to. When I finally worked up the nerve to say something, it was awkward and clumsy. I don't even remember what I said, just the way she looked up at me curious, with this small, playful smirk that made me feel like I'd already lost the game she was playing. Somehow it worked. One conversation led to another, and before long, we were inseparable. Lisa had this way of making everything feel more alive, like the world wasn't just some mundane grind we all slogged through. We graduated together, moved to the same city, and within 2 years, I was on one knee, proposing at that same coffee shop. Lisa said yes before I even got the words out, and the place erupted in applause. It felt like one of those moments you carry with you forever. Simple, perfect, and untainted by all the things life eventually throws at you. Marriage wasn't always smooth sailing, but we were happy. I worked long hours as an architect, constantly buried in blueprints and late-night deadlines. Lisa, on the other hand, kept things balanced. She was a kindergarten teacher, and she loved it. Her stories about the kids' wild imaginations and the bizarre things they said kept our dinner conversations lively. We built a life together, a house in the suburbs, 2 kids, summer road trips, the whole package. And then there was Nick. Nick had been my best friend since we were kids. We grew up on the same street, played on the same little league team, and even went to the same college. Lisa met Nick early on in our relationship, and the three of us naturally fell into an easy friendship. Nick was charming, the life of the party, always quick with a joke or ready to lend a hand. If I'm being honest, I think Lisa liked him the moment she met him, but not in the way I'd later come to suspect. Nick got married a few years after Lisa and I tied the knot, and we all grew even closer as couples. Dinners, game nights, family vacations, it was the kind of friendship you could count on, or so I thought. His wife, Amy, was just as much a part of our lives as Nick was. Looking back, there were probably signs I missed. Lisa always laughed a little too hard at Nick's jokes. Whenever we had people over, she'd drift toward him like it was second nature. But I brushed it off. We were all close, and I trusted them both with my life. That's the thing about trust. You never realize how fragile it is until it's gone. It wasn't until last summer that the cracks in our story started to show. We'd planned a family trip to a small beach town. Just Lisa, me, the kids, Nick, and Amy. The whole idea was to unwind and give the kids some memories they'd hold on to. Nick and I rented a small beach house, and the plan was simple: sun, sand, and relaxation. Lisa seemed different even before we left. She was distant, spending more time on her phone, texting with someone she'd always brush off as a friend from work. I figured she was just stressed, or maybe bored with the routine we'd fallen into. After all, 10 years of marriage can make things feel a little too predictable. By the time we arrived at the beach house, I had convinced myself the trip would fix everything. It was the perfect setting, the ocean stretching out endlessly, the smell of salt in the air, and the sound of waves crashing softly against the shore. The kids ran off to collect seashells, Amy started unpacking, and Nick cracked open a beer, grinning at me like we were still in college. For a few days, it felt like the good old times. We barbecued by the beach, played board games, and told stories around a small fire pit. But every now and then, I'd catch Lisa and Nick exchanging glances that felt too long, too familiar. I tried to ignore it. After all, Lisa was my wife. Nick was my best friend. What reason did I have to doubt them? The first real clue came on the third night. The kids were asleep, and the rest of us sat outside, staring at the stars. Lisa excused herself early, saying she wasn't feeling great. I stayed out there with Nick and Amy, chatting about nothing in particular. At one point, Nick slipped away, claiming he was going to check on Lisa. I didn't think twice about it. But looking back, I wish I had. This is just the beginning, but even as I write this, I can feel that strange knot in my chest, the one I ignored for far too long. The next morning, the beach house felt unusually quiet. The kids were still asleep, and the only sounds came from the faint rustling of palm trees outside the window. I rolled over in bed, expecting to see Lisa curled up next to me, but her side was empty. I sat up slowly, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, and glanced around the room. The house didn't feel right. After throwing on a t-shirt and stepping outside, I noticed the back patio door was slightly ajar, leading toward the pool area. The early morning sun reflected off the water, and as I walked closer, I could hear faint splashing and hushed voices. I stepped onto the deck, and there they were, Lisa and Nick, waist-deep in the pool, laughing quietly like teenagers sneaking around after curfew. I froze, watching them for a moment. Nick's arm brushed against Lisa's shoulder, and she didn't move away. Instead, she tilted her head back and laughed at something he whispered, her eyes sparkling in the sunlight. It was the kind of laugh I hadn't seen from her in months, light, carefree, almost flirtatious. I stood there, gripping the railing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't that they were doing anything outright inappropriate. They weren't wrapped around each other or sneaking kisses under the water. But there was something about the ease between them, the way they stood too close, like the space between them wasn't necessary. It was that subtle kind of intimacy that gnaws at you, the kind you can't explain but know is wrong. Nick finally noticed me first. His eyes flicked toward the deck, and his grin faltered for half a second. "Morning, man," he called out, his voice a little too loud, a little too friendly. Lisa couldn't sleep, so we decided to take a dip. Lisa turned then, startled as if she hadn't realized I was standing there. She wiped a few droplets of water from her face, offering me a sheepish smile. "I didn't want to wake you," she said quickly. "It was too hot to stay inside." I nodded, forcing a smile, but something about the scene lingered in the air. I wanted to believe them. I wanted to chalk it up to harmless fun, the kind of playful banter that happens between friends. But as I stood there watching the two of them in the water, that same knot in my chest from the other night tightened. Nick climbed out first, grabbing a towel and drying off without much urgency. "Hey, I was thinking about taking the boat out today," he said, flashing his usual easygoing grin. "You in?" I nodded again, though my mind was elsewhere. "Yeah, sure. Sounds good." Lisa followed Nick out of the pool, wrapping a towel around herself. Her eyes met mine briefly, and for a moment, I thought she looked guilty. But the look vanished as quickly as it had come. I spent the rest of the morning trying to shake the feeling that had planted itself in my chest. The thing about suspicion is that it starts small, a whisper in the back of your mind. But once it's there, it doesn't let go. It grows, spreads into every interaction, every glance exchanged, every innocent laugh between the two people you should trust the most. Later that afternoon, we took Nick's boat out along the coast. The sun was high, and the sea stretched endlessly in every direction. The kids laughed, clinging to Amy as she kept them safe at the front of the boat. Lisa sat next to Nick at the helm, one leg tucked beneath her as she leaned back comfortably. I sat in the back, watching. It was little things. The way Nick casually placed his hand on the small of her back when he passed by. The way Lisa seemed more animated talking to him than she had been with me in weeks. I told myself I was imagining things. That's what you do, right? You try to explain it away. It's nothing. They're just close friends. You're being paranoid. But paranoia has a way of creeping into everything. By the time we returned to the beach house, I was exhausted. Not physically, but mentally. I couldn't keep watching every move they made without driving myself insane. That night, as we sat around the fire pit after the kids went to bed, Nick cracked another beer and leaned back in his chair, recounting some ridiculous story from our college days. Lisa laughed. Not the polite laugh she usually reserved for group settings, but the real one. The laugh she used to have for me. Amy was the first to call it a night. She kissed Nick's cheek and retreated inside. I sat there a little longer, watching as Nick and Lisa shared quiet glances over the flickering flames. Eventually, I stood, forcing a yawn. "I'm turning in," I said, trying to keep my voice light. Lisa glanced up at me, but she didn't move to follow. I'll stay out for a bit longer, she replied softly, sipping the last of her wine. Nick didn't move either. I nodded and walked inside, but I didn't go to bed. I sat in the darkened living room, listening. Outside, the faint hum of their conversation continued, underscored by the crackle of the fire. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't been able to admit to myself. I didn't know who Lisa was anymore. And worse, I didn't know if I wanted to find out. The next morning, I woke up with a heaviness that wasn't there before. Lisa was still asleep beside me, her breathing soft and even. I stared at the ceiling for a while, replaying the images of her and Nick in the pool, the way their shoulders brushed too naturally, too often. I kept telling myself it was nothing, but I didn't believe it. After breakfast, I stepped out onto the deck, needing some air. The ocean breeze hit me, and I saw Amy sitting alone by the water, sipping her coffee. She waved when she noticed me, and I took it as an invitation. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked as I sat down beside her on the sand. "Something like that," I replied, watching the waves. Amy and I had always been friendly, but this was the first time it felt like we were really talking, just the two of us. Nick and Lisa were usually the social butterflies, pulling us all together. But today, something about Amy's expression felt off. She was staring at the water, but I could tell her mind was elsewhere. "Hey," I started, choosing my words carefully. "You notice anything different about Nick lately?" Her eyes shifted slightly, but she didn't look at me. "Why do you ask?" I shrugged, keeping my tone casual. "I don't know. Just curious. Lisa and him seem pretty close this trip." Amy didn't say anything for a while. She sipped her coffee, her eyes narrowing slightly as she watched the distant figure of Nick and Lisa gathering seashells with the kids further down the beach. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet. "I've noticed things too." My heart sank a little. I had been hoping she'd brush it off, tell me I was imagining things. But the way her lips pressed into a thin line told me she'd been wrestling with the same thoughts. We sat there in silence for a while, the sound of the waves filling the space between us. "You think something's going on?" I asked eventually. Amy glanced at me, her gaze steady but cautious. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think we'd be fools not to pay attention." Her words lingered. "Maybe we should keep an eye out," I suggested, feeling strange even saying it. Not in a crazy way, just, see if we're imagining things. Amy gave a small nod, as if she had already been considering it herself. That afternoon, while Nick and Lisa took the kids into town for ice cream, Amy and I found ourselves lingering at the beach house. She suggested we take a walk down by the resort's pool area, where there were changing rooms and cabanas lined up along the edge of the beach. It felt wrong, spying on our own spouses like this, but there was something unsettling about how easy it had been for them to slip away together. We kept our distance, staying out of sight near one of the shaded lounge areas. I felt ridiculous, crouching behind a cabana like some bad detective from a late-night TV show. Amy stood beside me, her arms crossed tightly. "Maybe we're overthinking it," I whispered. "Maybe," she replied, her tone flat. And then we saw them. Nick and Lisa were standing by the changing rooms. Lisa held a beach towel over her arm, but instead of heading inside to change, they lingered outside the door, talking quietly. Nick's hand brushed against her lower back as he leaned in slightly, close enough that his lips nearly touched her ear. I felt Amy stiffen beside me. They weren't kissing, not yet, but it wasn't innocent either. Lisa laughed softly, playfully smacking Nick's arm with the towel. He caught her wrist gently, letting his hand linger just a second too long. The whole thing lasted less than a minute, but the weight of that moment hung in the air long after they disappeared into separate changing rooms. Amy exhaled sharply. I didn't say anything. What was there to say? We waited until they came back out, dressed and ready for the beach, smiling like nothing had happened. Nick spotted us and waved casually. Lisa followed his gaze, but she looked away quickly, her smile fading when she saw me. Neither Amy nor I mentioned what we'd seen. Later that night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we sat together again by the fire pit. Lisa and Nick were across from us, chatting easily, but I could feel Amy's tension matching my own. It felt like a game neither of us wanted to play. watching our spouses pretend nothing was happening while we pretended not to notice. Amy leaned toward me, her voice low so only I could hear. "I don't want to jump to conclusions," she said softly, "but if this keeps up, we can't just sit on it." I nodded slowly. "I know." And just like that, the vacation that was supposed to bring us all closer together started to unravel. The shift was subtle at first. The lingering glances, the inside jokes that didn't involve me, the moments I caught Nick's hand brushing against Lisa's lower back a little too often. I told myself I was imagining things, that they were just being playful, but doubt has a way of festering when you ignore it. It wasn't until the afternoon by the pool that everything snapped into focus. Nick suggested a swim while the kids were off building sandcastles with Amy. I wasn't in the mood, so I stayed behind, lounging under an umbrella with a cold beer in hand. Lisa didn't hesitate to follow him to the water. For a while, I watched them float lazily, laughing and talking like nothing else in the world mattered. They were close, closer than they should have been. Nick whispered something to Lisa, and she splashed him, grinning. Her bikini strap slipped slightly, and he reached over to adjust it for her. That was the first sign, but I let it go. Later, as the sun dipped low, Amy sat beside me, her face pinched in the way it always did when she was holding something back. "They've been gone a while," she muttered, nodding toward the changing rooms by the poolside cabanas. I hadn't noticed until she pointed it out. Nick and Lisa had left the water together almost 20 minutes ago, disappearing into the resort's nearby facilities. I felt that familiar knot tighten in my chest. "They're probably just getting dressed," I said, but I didn't believe it. Amy didn't respond, but the look she gave me said enough. "I'll check," I finally said, standing up. Amy followed me, her flip-flops crunching softly on the gravel path as we approached the changing rooms. The whole area was deserted, with most guests still lounging by the pool or down at the beach. I wasn't expecting to hear anything. I figured I'd knock, call Lisa's name, and she'd step out, maybe wrapped in a towel, looking at me like I was being ridiculous. But as we rounded the corner, I froze. The sound hit me first, muffled gasps, the quiet but unmistakable rhythm of intimacy echoing from behind one of the doors. Amy's face paled beside me. Neither of us moved at first, as if we were waiting for the scene to rewrite itself in our heads. Maybe it wasn't them. Maybe it was some other couple. But then I heard it. Lisa's voice. Breathless. Giggling. Nick's name slipped out of her mouth like it belonged there. Amy's hand flew to her mouth, but I couldn't look at her. My vision narrowed, locked on that door. Every nerve in my body screamed to kick it in, to confront them right there, but something held me back. I stepped back slowly, pulling Amy with me. "Let's go," I whispered. She hesitated, staring at the door like she wanted to burst inside, but eventually, she nodded. We walked in silence, the world around us suddenly muted by the weight of what we'd just seen, what we'd heard. Neither of us spoke until we reached the beach house. Amy finally sat down at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she stared at the floor. "What do we do?" she asked, barely above a whisper. I didn't answer right away. My heart was pounding so hard I thought she might hear it. "We don't say anything," I muttered, surprising even myself. Amy's head snapped up. "What?" "Not yet," I clarified, gripping the edge of the counter. "We need to know how far this goes. If it's just today, or if it's been happening for a while." Amy looked at me like I was insane. "You want to spy on them?" I met her gaze, and the cold rage burning in my chest told me I was right. "I want to know exactly how long they've been lying to us." She didn't argue, because deep down, I think she wanted the same thing. Amy and I sat in silence for a long time after we returned to the beach house. The weight of what we just witnessed hung in the air like a storm cloud, suffocating and heavy. Amy's hands trembled as she sipped from a glass of water, her eyes distant and unfocused. I knew she was replaying it in her head, just like I was. The muffled sounds, Lisa's voice, Nick's name. It was burned into both of us now, and there was no erasing it. "I can't believe this," Amy finally whispered, shaking her head. I set my beer down harder than I meant to, the glass clinking against the wood of the table. "Believe it." I heard it. We both did. Amy's eyes flickered toward me, and something shifted in her expression. Not just sadness, but something colder, more calculated. "So, what now?" she asked, her voice steadying. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, and stared at the flickering candle we had lit for ambience earlier in the night. Now it felt absurd, like we'd been playing house while our spouses had been sneaking around behind our backs. "We don't confront them," I said slowly. Amy arched an eyebrow. "No?" "Not yet," I replied, lifting my eyes to meet hers. "We need more. Proof. Something they can't deny or explain away. If we just accuse them, they'll lie. And I'm not giving them the satisfaction of twisting this." Amy nodded, chewing on her bottom lip. I could tell she was already on board. "Okay," she said carefully, her grip tightening on the glass. "But proof for what, exactly? Just so we can say, 'I told you so'?" I shook my head. "Divorce." Her breath caught in her throat. "Look, I'm not playing games with this," I continued. "Lisa can make her choice. She already has. But I'm not going to sit here and pretend everything's fine. I want to hit them where it hurts, and I want Nick to feel it just as much as Lisa." Amy placed her glass down and crossed her arms. Her eyes narrowed, and I could see the same fire burning in her that I felt in my chest. "You want to ruin them," she said. I didn't even hesitate. "Yes, and I think we should time it perfectly. Something that'll hit hard and make it impossible for them to recover from." Amy's lips twisted into a bitter smile. "Their anniversary?" I grinned despite myself. Nick and Amy's anniversary was 2 months away. A lavish event they had already been planning with friends and family. Nick loved showing off, especially when it came to celebrating milestones. Lisa and I had been invited. Of course, we'd even talked about getting them something big. It was the perfect time to strike. "Imagine," Amy said darkly, handing him divorce papers in front of everyone. His family, his parents, our kids. I leaned back, letting the image settle in. "And Lisa too. I'll file and make sure she gets her papers at the same time." Amy drummed her fingers on the table, deep in thought. "So, we collect evidence. Make sure there's no room for denial." I nodded. "We'll start now. Track their movements. Photos, videos if we have to. But we wait for the perfect moment." Amy's eyes flickered with something new, something I hadn't seen before. A spark of revenge. "And while we're doing that," she said slowly, her gaze locking with mine, "maybe we make things interesting." I tilted my head. "Interesting how?" Amy leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Let's give them a taste of their own medicine. If they're going to sneak around like teenagers, let's make them think something's happening between us." I blinked, surprised by her suggestion. "Play them at their own game?" I asked carefully. Amy nodded, her expression hard. "Nick's always been jealous. It won't take much. A touch here, a little flirting there. Let them wonder if we're doing more than just sitting around waiting for the betrayal to happen." I considered it for a long moment, watching the way Amy's lips curved into a sly grin. The thought of playing along felt strange at first, but the more I thought about it, the more it felt right. "They deserve it," I said finally. Amy raised her glass in a silent toast. "To revenge," she said softly. I clinked my beer against her glass. To revenge. That night, we laid the groundwork. Amy began going through Nick's phone records and credit card statements, while I quietly accessed Lisa's email. We'd both long since memorized our spouses' passwords, little bits of trust they never thought would backfire. By morning, we had already started to uncover more than we wanted to know. Hidden messages, late-night receipts for hotel rooms, pictures they didn't even bother deleting properly. As I looked through Lisa's phone, Amy stood beside me, leaning over my shoulder. She rested her hand lightly on my back, a subtle gesture, but enough to make Lisa pause when she walked into the room. Lisa's eyes flickered between Amy's hand and my phone, but she said nothing. She smiled politely, but I caught the slight tightening of her jaw. Amy played it cool, brushing my shoulder playfully as she walked away. It was a small seed of doubt, the first crack, and it was only the beginning. The week leading up to Nick and Amy's anniversary party felt like a strange calm before the storm. Lisa was more attentive than usual. Soft kisses in the morning, small talk over dinner, and playful teasing that felt forced, as if she could sense the distance growing between us. I played along, but in the quiet moments, I felt nothing but cold detachment. Amy and I had kept in touch, but only in small doses to avoid suspicion. We didn't need to meet frequently anymore. Everything was already in place. Nick and Lisa's affair wasn't just an occasional lapse of judgment. It was frequent, careless. The more I watched, the easier it became to gather proof. They had left crumbs everywhere: text messages, late-night calls, overlapping bank transactions. It almost felt like they wanted to be caught. But I wasn't going to confront them in the privacy of our home. No, that would be too easy. Amy and I wanted the fallout to be unforgettable. Nick and Amy's anniversary party was the perfect stage. The party was set to be lavish. Nick wouldn't have it any other way. It was being held at a high-end venue downtown, the kind of place with overpriced champagne and waiters in tuxedos. Friends and family were flying in from across the country. Lisa had been talking about the event for weeks, excitedly picking out outfits and helping Amy with small details. "You're going to love this," Lisa told me one night as she tried on dresses in front of the mirror. "Nick's gone all out this year. He said it's going to be their biggest party yet." I sat on the bed, pretending to scroll through my phone. "I'm sure it will be," I replied, careful to keep any emotion out of my voice. Lisa held up a sleek, black dress, studying herself in the reflection. "What do you think?" she asked, twirling slightly. I glanced up, holding her gaze in the mirror. "It's perfect. I'm sure Nick will think so too." She froze for just a moment, long enough for me to catch the flicker of doubt in her eyes. But she said nothing. The night of the party arrived, and Lisa was glowing as we walked into the venue. Nick and Amy greeted us at the entrance. Nick wore his signature grin, dressed in a sharp suit that made him look like he belonged at the center of attention. Amy, however, was stunning in a bold red dress that drew more than a few glances. Lisa noticed Amy's dress immediately. "Wow, you two match," she said, glancing between me and Amy. I tugged at the lapel of my dark suit. "Coincidence," I said casually, but the way Amy smiled at me made it seem like more. Nick's arm slid around Amy's waist, but his eyes lingered on the way Amy leaned toward me when she whispered something about the guest list. The game had officially begun. Throughout the night, Amy and I moved deliberately, never crossing the line but pushing just close enough to make Nick and Lisa squirm. A light touch on the arm. Quiet laughter shared over drinks. We didn't need to say anything. The tension spoke for itself. Lisa stuck by Nick's side more than usual, laughing at his jokes and stealing glances across the room whenever I was near Amy. Nick, for his part, tried to play it cool, but I caught him watching Amy and me more than once, his usual confidence cracking around the edges. It wasn't long before the speeches began. Nick took center stage, raising his glass in celebration. "To my beautiful wife," he began, flashing that charming smile that had probably worked on countless people over the years. "Thank you for putting up with me for all these years. Here's to many more." Amy smiled politely, but I could see the tension in her grip on the champagne flute. As the applause died down, waiters began moving through the crowd, handing out small, elegantly wrapped gift bags to each guest. Party favors, courtesy of Nick and Amy. Inside Nick and Lisa's gift bags, however, were something far less festive. Divorce papers. I watched from across the room as Nick opened his, eyes narrowing at the sight of the legal documents tucked beneath the tissue paper. Lisa's hand dipped into her bag moments later, and I saw her expression shift from confusion to panic as she unfolded the papers with trembling fingers. Nick looked toward Amy, his face pale. "What the hell is this?" he hissed under his breath. Amy's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. Lisa, wide-eyed, turned to me. "Is this some kind of joke?" she asked, voice shaking. I didn't say anything. I simply met her gaze and placed my wedding ring gently on the edge of the nearest table. "Happy anniversary," I said softly before walking away. Behind me, Nick and Lisa scrambled to keep the facade from crumbling in front of their guests. But it was too late. Whispers rippled through the room as Amy and I slipped quietly out the front doors, the cool night air washing over us. Amy exhaled, letting out a shaky laugh. "Think they'll recover from that?" I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in months. Not a chance. The drive home from Nick and Amy's anniversary party was silent. Lisa sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, one hand gripping the crumpled divorce papers like they might dissolve if she held them tight enough. Her phone buzzed on and off, probably Nick trying to make sense of the fallout that had just unraveled in front of their friends and family. I didn't ask. I didn't care. By the time we pulled into the driveway, Lisa finally broke the silence. Is this really happening? Her voice trembled, barely above a whisper. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. It's been happening, Lisa. You just thought I wouldn't find out? Her breath hitched, and when I looked at her, I saw tears welling in her eyes. Not the kind of tears that came from genuine remorse. These were the tears of someone who got caught and wasn't ready for the consequences. It didn't mean anything, she whispered, shaking her head. It was stupid. We were drunk. I wasn't thinking. I almost laughed. You weren't thinking the first time, maybe? But what about the other dozen times after that? Lisa's eyes widened slightly, and she opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. I stepped out of the car, leaving her to sit there alone. Inside, the kids were asleep upstairs, their soft breathing the only sound in the house. I lingered in their rooms for a while, watching them as they slept, peaceful and unaware of how much their lives were about to change. This wasn't just about Lisa and me. It was about them too. I thought about how I'd explain it to them, how I'd tell them that the family we built was breaking apart and that it wasn't their fault. They were too young to understand betrayal, but they'd feel the effects of it regardless. Lisa joined me in our bedroom a while later. She sat on the edge of the bed, head in her hands, the papers still clutched tightly. "Please," she whispered, voice cracking. "Don't do this. We can fix it. We can go to counseling. Anything you want. I'll end it with Nick. It's already over." I stared at her, feeling a strange sense of detachment. Maybe a year ago, those words would have meant something. But now they felt hollow, just like the trust we once had. "It's already over," I repeated quietly. "But not between you and Nick, between us." Tears rolled down her cheeks, and she shook her head violently. "Don't do this to the kids. Please. They need their family." I knelt down in front of her, my voice soft but firm. They need honesty. They need parents who aren't lying to each other every day. And they deserve better than watching their father pretend everything's fine when it's not. Lisa wiped at her tears, sniffing. "You're really not going to forgive me?" I met her gaze, holding it steady. "I could forgive the cheating, Lisa, but I can't forgive the months of lying. The sneaking around, making me feel like I was crazy while you slept with my best friend. That's not something we come back from." She sobbed quietly, curling into herself, but I felt no urge to comfort her. The next day, Amy and I met for coffee. It wasn't some celebratory reunion, just a quiet, necessary meeting to go over final steps. Nick had left the house the night before after Amy made it clear there was no saving their marriage. She told him to pack a bag and not come back. From what she'd mentioned, Nick hadn't put up much of a fight. He tried the same thing Lisa did, Amy said, stirring her coffee slowly. Excuses. Tears. But it was more pathetic than anything else. I nodded, understanding completely. I think they thought we'd crumble when they did, like we'd let it go. Amy's lips twitched in something that resembled a bitter smile. Not this time. We sat quietly for a while, both of us exhausted from the weight of it all. "You know," she added softly, "I keep thinking about the kids, how we explain this without wrecking them." I sighed, leaning back in my chair. "I've been thinking about that too. I guess we just keep it simple. No bad-mouthing, no pointing fingers, just, sometimes marriages end." Amy nodded. "Yeah, and maybe when they're older, they'll understand more." The hardest part wasn't leaving Lisa. It was knowing that no matter how much I protected the kids from this, the scars would still be there. "They're resilient," Amy said, almost like she could read my thoughts. I nodded, but it still didn't make it easier. In the following weeks, Lisa tried everything: apologies, promises, even gifts. But my decision never wavered. I filed the papers quietly and moved forward one step at a time. Nick tried to reach out, but I never answered. There wasn't anything left to say. Amy and I kept our friendship intact, bonded by the strange experience of watching our marriages collapse side by side. It wasn't romantic, and it didn't need to be. Sometimes, betrayal has a way of clarifying things, showing you the people you can trust and the ones you can't. And as hard as it was, I finally felt like I could breathe again. Breaking the news to the kids was hard, but telling our parents was something else entirely. Lisa didn't want to face them. I think she knew that the moment the truth came out, whatever thin layer of sympathy she hoped to cling to would disappear. So, I did it alone. I drove to my parents' house on a Sunday afternoon, leaving Lisa at home with the kids. My mom answered the door, smiling wide like she always did when I came by unannounced. "Hey, honey, you should have told me you were coming," she said, pulling me into a hug. "Didn't want to make a big deal of it," I replied, stepping inside. She led me into the living room, where my dad sat reading the paper, his glasses low on his nose. He glanced up, raising an eyebrow. "Well, this is a surprise," he said, folding the paper in half. "Everything all right?" I sat down across from them, leaning forward with my hands clasped. The weight of the conversation hung in the air like a lead curtain. "Lisa and I are getting a divorce." The words came out more evenly than I expected, but my mom's reaction was instant. Her face fell, and she reached for my hand without hesitation. "Oh, honey, I had no idea things were bad." Dad didn't say anything at first. His eyes narrowed slightly, studying me in that quiet way he always did when he suspected I wasn't giving him the full story. "It's been coming for a while," I continued, "but I didn't want to tell anyone until things were final." Mom squeezed my hand, her expression soft with concern. "Is there any way to work it out? Counseling, maybe? You've been together so long." I swallowed hard, shaking my head. "It's not that simple." Dad leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His gaze sharpened. "Did she cheat?" I glanced at him, and the unspoken answer must have shown in my face because his jaw tightened almost immediately. "That's what I thought," he muttered under his breath. Mom's hand shot to her chest, eyes wide. "Lisa? I never thought," she trailed off, clearly struggling to piece it together. "With Nick," I added, watching as realization dawned on them both. Dad's grip on the paper tightened until it crumpled in his fist. "That bastard," he growled, standing up abruptly. "How long?" "Months," I replied. "Maybe longer. Amy and I found out on vacation." Mom's hand covered her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. "Oh, James, I'm so sorry." "It's done," I said quietly. "I've filed the papers. I just wanted you both to hear it from me before the kids start asking questions." Dad paced the room, his fists clenching and unclenching like he was ready to drive over to Nick's house right then and there. I wouldn't have stopped him. Mom dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "And the kids? How are they handling it?" "They don't know everything. Just that Lisa and I are separating." I sighed, rubbing the back of my neck. "I'm trying to keep it simple. I don't want them caught in the middle of this." Mom nodded, her expression softening. "You're doing the right thing." "I hope so." Dad finally sat back down, shaking his head. "I never liked Nick," he muttered. "Always thought he was too smooth for his own good." Mom shot him a look, but even she didn't argue this time. "I'll be all right," I assured them, standing up. "I just wanted you to know." Mom hugged me tightly, holding on a little longer than usual. "You know we're here for you," she whispered. "Anything you need." "I know." Dad walked me to the door, gripping my shoulder firmly. "If that son of a bitch tries to talk to you, tell him to stay far away. If not, call me." I smirked faintly. "I think Amy's already made it clear he's not welcome anywhere near us." He grunted approvingly. "Good. Let her tear him apart." Lisa's parents were next. That conversation went about as expected. Shock, denial, and then the inevitable awkwardness of realizing their daughter was the one who blew everything up. Her mom cried, asking if there was any way to salvage the marriage, while her dad just sat there quietly, nodding but not saying much. I could tell he knew. Maybe not the full extent, but he had the look of a man who'd seen the cracks forming and chose to ignore them. "We're going to keep things civil for the kids," I told them at the end. "I don't want them caught up in the middle of this." Her mom nodded tearfully. Of course. Just know we're still here for the kids, and for you too." I appreciated the sentiment, but I knew things would change. There was no way around it. Amy and I kept our distance after the initial storm, focusing on the paperwork, the logistics, and keeping our kids' routines intact. Lisa's attempts to reach out grew less frequent. Eventually, she stopped trying altogether. Nick, on the other hand, tried once, showing up at my office without warning. I didn't let him pass the lobby. He stared at me through the glass, hands in his pockets, looking every bit the remorseful friend. But I wasn't interested in hearing whatever speech he had prepared. I met his gaze for a moment, then turned around and walked back to my office. There was nothing left to say. The finality of it all didn't hit me until I stood in front of the judge, pen in hand, signing the last document that dissolved my marriage. The courtroom was quiet, sterile, and the whole process took less than 15 minutes. Lisa wasn't there. Neither was Nick. Amy sat 2 rows behind me, her arms crossed as she watched the proceedings with quiet resolve. Her divorce had been finalized a week earlier, and this felt more like the last item on a long checklist than an emotional event. When the judge confirmed the papers were processed, I nodded politely and left without a second glance. Outside the courthouse, the summer heat felt heavier than usual. Amy followed me to the steps, where we stood in silence for a while, both staring at the bustling street ahead. "That's it," I said, almost to myself. Amy nodded. "It's over." I wasn't sure if I felt relief or emptiness. Maybe both. "You okay?" Amy asked after a moment, tilting her head toward me. I let out a slow breath, rolling my shoulders. "I think so. It's weird. I thought I'd feel more. I don't know, angry?" She smiled faintly. "I think we used up all the anger already." She wasn't wrong. By the time the papers were signed, I had already felt everything there was to feel: betrayal, sadness, rage. Now, there was just this strange quiet. "Kids doing okay?" Amy asked as we walked to the parking lot. "Yeah." I explained everything as simply as I could. "They're still asking questions, but I think they're handling it better than I expected." Amy nodded, brushing hair from her face. "Same here. It's hardest at night when they ask why Nick isn't around anymore." We reached our cars, parked side by side. Amy hesitated for a moment, leaning against the driver's side door. "You ever wonder if this whole thing brought us closer, or just threw us into the same mess?" I smirked faintly. "A little of both, I guess." Amy laughed softly. It was the first time I'd heard her laugh in weeks without bitterness behind it. "Well," she said, opening her door, "at least we made it out of the mess. Some people stay in it for years." "Yeah, I guess we did." I watched her drive off, feeling lighter than I had in months. The house felt emptier when I got back. Lisa had moved her things out gradually, never making a big scene of it. One day it was her clothes, the next day a few family photos she wanted to keep. I let her take what she wanted. The absence of her presence wasn't sad. It was peaceful. The kids were at school, so I wandered into the living room, sitting down on the couch with a cold drink in hand. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't worried about what Lisa was doing or who she was with. I wasn't trying to catch glimpses of text messages over her shoulder or listening for hushed conversations behind closed doors. The weight of it all had lifted. Later that evening, Amy called. "Hey," she said, her voice softer than usual. "The kids and I are going out for pizza. You and the boys want to join?" I smiled, already grabbing my keys. "Yeah, I think we'd like that." For the first time in a long while, life felt like it was moving forward. Not perfectly, not without pain, but forward. And that was enough. If you were in my position, would you have waited to gather evidence and reveal everything publicly? Or would you have confronted Lisa and Nick the moment you discovered the affair? Do you think orchestrating the divorce on anniversary party was justified? Or do you believe there's a better way to handle betrayal? Let me know how you would have handled it in the comments. Thanks for being here. Make sure to subscribe to Deceived Buddy so you don't miss any new stories. And as always, see you in the next video.